Gentle-lady viewers and gentlemen viewers, good evening and welcome to our Historical Sketches show. As I mentioned, I believe in the first episode of this series, the philosopher Nietzsche, when referring to history, said that there were no historical facts, but only interpretations rather. If that is true, when dealing with actual real and undeniable events, the truth is even stronger when instead of facts we deal with historical individuals. It does not matter whether they are real, imaginary or mythical, meaning that with people, just as with facts, there are only representations, or rather the perceptions that we have of, or that we form, the perception that we have or that we form of those people. Now, given the character who is the subject of today's sketch, it must be said that the considerations presented here are, as the name of the series implies or says, historical, and do not impinge or intend to impinge on any possible religious belief or lack thereof. In fact, the character of whom we will talk here hovers between the historical, the religious and the mythical. And I'm referring to Joseph, the putative father of Christ. By the way, to inject a dash of etymology, the adjective putative is derived from the late Latin and it means supposed or believed to be. And it is just this adjective, putative, at the roots of the historical, ideological, graphic, artistic, and even political interpretation of the figure of Saint Joseph. And let us see how all this develops. Now, as you know, the Christian New Testament has at its core the Gospels, of which there are 4, respectively, of Matthew, Luke, Mark, and John. Now, these are called the Canonical Gospels, meaning that they are the accepted version by the Church, accepted as the authentic representations of the life of Christ, which is fine, but it should be tempered by the consideration that there is consensus that the Canonical Gospels were written from 70 to 100 years after the death of Christ. Now you can imagine there being no radio, television, and printing itself being a challenge. It means that what is written in the Gospels is the fruit mainly of oral traditions, which is another reason for their overall inconsistency among each other, between each other. Even so, besides the 4 canonical Gospels, there are other Gospels which are called Apocryphal, meaning not approved, or at least questionable, or plainly false. Of these Apocryphal Gospels, there are literally dozens. But even limiting ourselves to the canonical Gospels, in them there is hardly any mention of Joseph. Luke briefly mentions Joseph's genealogy in the episode when Jesus is lost in the temple and Joseph and Mary go looking for him. And Matthew mentioned him as the husband of Mary and only makes reference to him when he brings back the family to Israel after the death of Herod, the genocidal king, of whom we know all we know. That's it. There isn't much to build a history of Joseph based on the canonical Gospels. But what the canonical Gospels do not say is amply made up by the apocryphal, unofficial Gospels. And it is from the unofficial Gospels that if you like, the persona of Saint Joseph has been derived and constructed, as we see in this program, this sketch. The apocryphal Gospels contain a varied and complicated mixtures of folklore, of legends, of fantastic theories built on episodes that mix together the Old and the New Testament. And from this concoction of information obtained from the Apocryphal Gospels, there are derived some characteristics of St. Joseph, some of which are still extant today, especially among the Catholics. Let's see what they are. One, that St. Joseph was much older than Mary. Two, that he was in possession of a walking stick painted in the early 1600s and found in a church in Spoleto, Italy. And finally, that he was a carpenter by profession. According to some, he actually married Mary when he was 84 years old, and according to another apocryphal gospel, he actually married her when he was 90. And as I said, he was also a carpenter by profession. But even so, all these three characteristics that I mentioned begin to appear not at the beginning, but in the 5th century AD, 500 years later. And until then, until the 5th century, Joseph appears young, and he was represented with a thick beard and in full strength, as you can perhaps glean from this detail from a carving in the Basilica of St. Mary Major, Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. But why did Joseph become old so quickly and so rapidly in his graphic representations? And the reason is simple. It had to do with the dogmatic and theological considerations centering around the virginity of Mary. It was a dogma that, during the 1st century of Christianity, caused many speculations, fractures, heresies, and mythical efforts to resolve a very thorny theological problem. After all, as I said, the canonical Gospels do not even make reference to this thorny issue, and Joseph is hardly mentioned at all, as I said. But from the point of view of theology, if Joseph is very old, there can be no doubt that he could not have participated in the pregnancy of Mary. And how did it come about that he married Mary in the first place? In one of the Apocryphal Gospels, Joseph is called by the authorities of the temple, is called to be part of an assembly of widowers. Among these widowers will be chosen Mary's husband. And Mary in this narrative is an adolescent girl, 12 years old. And before entering the temple, where Mary was staying, or where was, the widowers had to leave out of the temple their respective walking sticks. And the fact that all of them used a walking stick is a general indication that they were all pretty old. While the deliberation about who the husband of Mary should be, it just so happened that Joseph's walking stick suddenly blossomed into flowers, which was a clear sign that he was the target of the divine selection. Now, he's a bit taken aback, and according to this particular apocryphal narrative, he said, "I do not want to become the laughingstock of the sons of Israel." He says, "I have sons and I am old. She is only a young girl." Of course, he could not refuse. However, the fact that Joseph was very old when he married Mary still left the theological issue of what constitutes a matrimony, a marriage, unresolved, at least in the medieval legislation. And it was a learned monk of the time, Gratian, by the name of Gratian, who resolved the difficult question. In a decree that he wrote, Gratian that is, in the 12th century, we find that there are two stages in a marriage. The beginning of the marriage, when the couple express their consent to marriage, and the consummation of the marriage proper. And according to the decree of Gratian, the beginning of the marriage is in itself sufficient to make the marriage valid. After much debate, the final verdict, issued in the same 12th century, was that for a marriage to be valid, it was sufficient that the consent of the party be given in words expressed in the present tense. In simple words, there could be a marriage even if there was no consummation. Issue resolved, caso cerrado. The marriage between an old man and a young girl was no longer a problem, as we can see on this bas relief or low relief that we find in the Abbey of Thun, a city located in northeastern France. As far as his profession, that Joseph was a carpenter was a discovery of another apocryphal writer of the 5th century. And that is why we find Joseph usually represented, as I said, as a carpenter in the paintings of the Middle Ages, as, for example, in the one shown here by the Flemish painter Robert Campin, who painted the image in 1427. And from the 5th century onwards, the narratives about Joseph multiply. The overall image that we can glean from the narratives, as well as from the paintings, is that of an honest man, obedient to the will of God, but overall unable to understand the divine mystery, and who is somewhat uncertain about the business of the pregnancy of Mary. In one of the many, as I said, apocryphal Gospels, Joseph gives vent to his anger and frustrations. He is convinced of being the victim of a fraud, and he is concerned about the censure that he will incur from the community. And though some virgin friends of Mary reassure him of how things stand, Joseph is convinced that all these girls are complicit in his betrayal. And the doubt about a possible betrayal of Mary developed further during the first part of the Middle Ages. The doubt converted into a mixture of derision and banter around the figure of Joseph, which found its way into several artistic and literary expressions of that age, in paintings, particularly in sacred representations, as well as in popular songs. The idea of the divine conception contrasted strongly with the male model that existed in the eyes of medieval man. And we can see some graphical evidence in this painting of the adoration of the Magi and of the kings by the Flemish painter Peter Bruegel. In the picture we can see a man who whispers into Joseph's ears to instill doubt as to the Immaculate Conception. Joseph again is portrayed as an old and somewhat clumsy peasant. If we consider the Middle Ages in their entirety, say from 800 to 1400 AD, the figure of Joseph remains ambiguous. On one end, his representation borders, as I said, with the irreverent. But at a certain point there begins to be a kind of reconsideration. Joseph was to begin a remarkable transformation in status, no longer one of irony, but of great respect, and a transformation as well as a transformation in age. No longer old, but young and strong. And why, you may ask? Because it was difficult to separate the cult of Joseph from the cult of Mary. And the cult of Mary developed and blossomed not long after the year 1000, and also for understandable reasons. After all, the Judeo-Christian God is quite harsh and unmoved by requests for pity or for indulgence. We have just to keep in mind Michelangelo's representation of God on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He's an old man with eyes severe and beard of formal cut, as Shakespeare would say. And with an expression like that, it was clear that God would have none of it. the humble brethren will be so intimidated as not to show where to begin. So in the circumstances, there grew the idea that Mary, a figure by definition more gentle for the fact of being a woman, and besides being also the mother of Christ, grew the idea that she could be more effective in interceding on behalf of the mortals who lived, as you well know, in an age of pestilence, of famine, of wars, of invasions by the Turks, by the Magyars, by the Normans, and just to name some of the hordes of barbarians pressing from all sides towards the center and the south of Europe. Yet, notwithstanding this cultural change, in many representations, all the way through the end of the Middle Ages, Joseph is persistently represented as an old man with a distinctive, unintelligent expression. He clearly belonged to a social status inferior to Mary's, and in the paintings he is usually shown in a corner, as for example in this nativity scene by a French painter of the 14th century. Joseph is shown as he cuts either his trousers or his socks to make some swaddling clothes for the baby Jesus, while Mary looks on. And you may notice that the ox and the donkey are more central than Joseph, as they seem to be warming the newborn baby under the watchful eye of the midwife. Up above, God approves with a gesture of one hand while holding a planet, or maybe the moon, with the other hand. And in this other painting by Hieronymus Bosch, about 1495, Joseph dries out Jesus' clothes by the fire under a canopy that has seen better days. Or, in this painting by Martin Schongauer, painted in about 1470-75, he brings in a lamp to provide some lighting for the room. And in this other painting, which is actually a wood carving, subsequently colored, Joseph helps the midwife to pour the water in the wash basin to give the baby a bath. As far as written records are concerned, records of what are called medieval mysteries, Joseph is a protagonist of medieval folklore, an old man who marries a young girl and who is betrayed by her. In the English medieval mystery called The Cycle of N-Town, Joseph rejects Mary's explanation and blames her because all the people in the village will laugh about his impotence. Another representation of Joseph finds him preparing the baby food, which looks like our oatmeal, and again is found in another colored wood carving dated around 1410. Note also how much smaller the figure of Joseph is compared to the figure of Mary's, which is a symbolic representation of the relative unimportance of Joseph. I said earlier on that there is ambiguity throughout the Middle Ages regarding Joseph, and another legend that found ample representations in popular songs and in paintings refers to the miracle of the palm tree, as you can see in this image. Mary had asked Joseph to pick up some dates from the palm tree, but Joseph, whom you see on the left, still doubtful regarding her pregnancy, answers impolitely, inviting her to ask the father of her son to pick the dates himself, at which point the palm tree spontaneously bends itself so that Mary herself can pick the dates. Dates, as we know, only grow in the warm climates, so the European version of the legend converted the palm tree into a cherry tree. One more anecdotal element about the walking stick, from the tip of which blossomed the flowers to signify that Joseph had been chosen by the heavens to be Mary's husband. You may recall that one of the largest business of the Middle Ages had to do with sacred relics. And as the cult of St. Joseph developed and expanded, even the flowering walking stick moved from legend to reality. And there are several authentic specimens of the flowering walking stick, all of course believed to be the original. There is one in Florence, there is one in the Church of St. Mary of the Angels in Rome, and in Florence, and one of the church, and in Rome in the churches of Saint Cecilia and Saint Anastasia, in the Church of Saint Joseph in Naples, and in the Cathedral of Beauvais in France. In Naples, the relic had been brought by a knight by the name of Grimaldi. He had built a chapel in his house around the flowering stick, and once a year he allowed the faithful in the city into his house, and they were allowed to touch this miraculous walking stick. But many devout people tried surreptitiously to detach small pieces to keep them for their miraculous powers. And from this habit arose a sentence still in use in the Neapolitan dialect. It is a bit coarse in its meaning, which is, "But do not annoy me, leave me alone." But the real dramatic change, we could say, in the perception and the representation of Joseph began at the time of the Counter-Reformation in the middle of the 16th century. I already mentioned that the reinterpretation of Joseph's character started with the interpretation of the new role of Mary, who interceded with God on behalf of the brethren who were presumably afraid to ask. A pioneer of this reinterpretation of Joseph was Bernard of Clairvaux, the founder of the Cistercian order of monks. And Pope Sixtus V in the 1500s officially established the 19th of March as the day for the celebration of St. Joseph. And particularly in the south of Italy, Joseph, or Joe among the immigrants, is one of the most popular patron saints, and, as you may know, Joseph and its derivatives probably is the most popular name in the south of Italy. Now, in 1870, Joseph was officially named by Pope Pius IX a patron of the Church, and which was, if you may agree, a pretty dramatic transformation in 1,000 years. Now, in fact, from an almost inexistent character in the Canonical Gospels and from an old, decrepit, silly-looking character of the unofficial Gospels, Joseph grew to become a part of the model of the ideal family, a father endowed with authority, obeyed by Jesus and Mary, and on whom both Jesus and Mary apply for advice and counsel. And this is how he is represented today in Catholic churches throughout the world, as you can see in this picture. And yet, it is not the end. In the middle of the 20th century, Joseph becomes a kind of political symbol. To take a step back, the working conditions of the majority of people during as the Industrial Revolution evolved were horrible, dramatically horrible, as Dickens has so well described in his novels. And all this led to a number of revolutions, repressions, upheavals throughout Europe, eventually culminating after many deaths in many countries in Europe, culminating in the 1917 with the October Revolution in Russia. Now, the consequences of the revolution, now we're getting closer to almost to our historical times, the consequences were felt throughout the world, in America, and even more so in Europe. We all know about the Roosevelt's New Deal, and when he was faced with bitter accusations from the right that he was weak against communism, he countered by saying that the New Deal was the only way that he had at hand to save capitalism. In Europe, the communist threat or communist promise, depending on your point of view, was even stronger. And Labor Day in Europe falls, and still falls at least in most places. It doesn't fall on the first weekend of September. It falls on the first of May. This is, of course, as the name implies, a lay feast, not connected with religious anniversaries or religious ceremonies. But the Catholic Church has always been notoriously anti-socialist and anti-communist. However, looking at the post-Second World War period, and given the hold of the May 1st holiday, the hold on the popular mind, the Church could not let Labor Day go unchallenged, so to speak. And in 1955, Pope Pius named Saint Joseph patron saint of the workers. And by so doing, a religious element could be infused into what was otherwise a dangerous and non-religious day of celebration. In summary, and to conclude, from an old man, ridiculed and poorly represented throughout the Middle Ages, Joseph has become a vigorous, adult, young, and he still is, at least in current theological thinking and in current representations. So this is the end of our historical sketch on Saint Joseph, the man who grew younger, or the saint who grew younger with the passing of time. I will thank the crew, and in particular our director, Kat Iverson. Thank you for watching. This is Jimmy Molia for Historical Sketches, and see you next time. Good night.